Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Annenberg Theater at the Museum. My name is Charles Haynes, and I direct the Religious Freedom Education Project here at the museum. The mission of that project is very simple. It's to educate the public about the meaning and significance of the religious liberty clauses of the First Amendment, the guiding principles that undergird this American experiment in freedom of conscience for people of all faiths and none. And tonight, we are pleased to join with WETA to present this special screening of First Freedom, The Fight for Religious Liberty. We're very grateful to Lee Groberg for making this timely and insightful film, and to WETA for making it available to the American people. Now, following the screening, we will welcome to the stage Nina Totenberg, National Public Radio Legal Affairs correspondent, who will moderate a panel discussion on religious liberty in America, past and present. So let me take this opportunity to thank in advance our moderator, as well as the two outstanding historians who are going to be on the panel, Douglas Brinkley, who's Professor of History at Rice University, and John Butler, who's Professor Emeritus of American Studies, History, and Religious Studies at Yale University. Before we begin, a reminder and an announcement. The reminder is, of course, to mute your cell phones. Now, of course, during the panel discussion, please tweet. But aside from that, well, you know, that's what you have to do now. The announcement is a little bit of a commercial for what's coming next. Mark your calendars on Tuesday, October 30th, a little over a week, 1 week before the election. The Religious Freedom Education Project and Moment Magazine will present a very lively discussion on religion, the Supreme Court, and the 2012 election. We're going to ask the question, what's at stake for the court and religious freedom depending on the outcome of the election? And we're going to be joined by Jacques Berlinerbaugh, David Saperstein, Melissa Rogers, and Kyle Duncan. And that will begin at 6:30 in the Night Conference Center, which is upstairs, and I hope you will join us for that program as well. Well, now for tonight's program, it's my pleasure to introduce our partner here tonight, who has done a lot to make this happen tonight, the Vice President for Production Management at WETA, Jim Corpley. Jim?
Welcome, everyone. My name is Jim Corpley, Vice President of Production Management for WETA's National Production Unit, and I'm also fortunate enough to be the project executive for WETA on this terrific film. WETA is the third largest producing station for public television. Among our key productions are the PBS NewsHour, Washington Week, and the documentaries of Ken Burns. And tonight we are very proud to include the film we'll be watching in just a moment to WETA's roster of titles. On behalf of our Chief Executive Officer, Sharon Rockefeller, and everyone at WETA, thank you for being here this evening. A special thanks to Charles Haynes and the Religious Freedom Education Project at the Museum for working so generously with us as a partner on this evening's proceedings. And also to the esteemed panel of participants who so graciously committed their time and expertise to making this a memorable event. So what we'll be watching this evening is about a 27-minute selection from the film First Freedom, the creation of Lee Groberg, who you'll meet momentarily. And as we often do in our department, I played a preliminary cut of this film for a small focus group, my family, to see what they thought of it. And we do this often. Does it look good? Did it sound good? Was it understandable? Did it hold their interest? Did it move? The mechanics of it. And at the end of the film, my 19-year-old son simply turned around to me and said, "Is this a great country or what?" And you can't beat that for a response, because what it means is he wasn't focusing on the mechanics, but on the message. Every documentary film is basically a delivery device. And while the delivery device may be what attracts attention, the message is what matters. The message is the payload. And if the film doesn't deliver a message, then that delivery device is just a device. Well, this film delivers. It delivers an understanding of the profound story that was the creation of this country, insight into the people who created it, and an appreciation for something that is so easily taken for granted now, but which at the time had never been heard of before in human history: the right to freedom of conscience, protected and guaranteed by the law of the land, protected even from the government itself. Tonight's production is a sterling example of public media at its best, a private and public partnership that is greater than the sum of its parts, creating content that educates and informs while it entertains, and utilizing the remarkable power of mass media to deliver that content to virtually the entire United States via the public airwaves. I want to emphasize private and public. This film in particular was underwritten entirely by the generous support of foundations, families, family foundations, and individuals, several of whom are in attendance here tonight and who deserve our collective gratitude. In the last several years in our industry, we have started using the phrase public media instead of public broadcasting because broadcasting isn't the only way we disseminate the valuable lessons provided by films like this. This program has a companion website, which launched today. You can find it at pbs.org/firstfreedom. And over the next 2 months, we will be populating that site with lesson plans, class activities, essays, video modules, links to primary documents mentioned in this film, and to other resources as well designed to help teachers, civic groups, and any other interested parties that may wish to take advantage of this material for even years beyond the premiere broadcast. And as for that premiere broadcast, First Freedom, as you can see, premieres here in Washington on WETA 26 and on public television stations nationwide on Tuesday, December 18th at 8 p.m. If you won't be in Washington on December 18th, please check local listings for your PBS station and for the date and time in your area. I'd now like to introduce you to the very accomplished producer, director of First Freedom, as well as many other films that have been seen on public television stations nationwide, Lee Groberg.
It's a humbling privilege to stand before you tonight. This is the culmination of some 5 years of work, not full-time, but nevertheless, a huge effort on a lot of people's parts. I'd like to first thank WETA, Sharon Rockefeller, Dalton DeLand, Karen Kenton, Jim Corbley, a great team, a great organization. And I'm looking forward to doing more films with them. I'd like to thank also, as Jim has, the funders who made this possible, some of whom are here tonight. It wouldn't happen. I can't afford to do this as a hobby. And so I do appreciate very much them sharing the faith and confidence and vision of telling these kinds of stories. Just a few minutes ago, a student from Wake Forest University who's here tonight asked me, so why did you do this? And the answer was because I felt moved upon to tell the story, recognizing that I knew very little about it. And so we interview people like John Butler, who you'll hear tonight, Charles Haynes, and others who weighed in on the story, reviewed the drafts of the script, and had some comment, for which I am very grateful. I thrive on criticism in the early stages of these developments. The buck ultimately stops when we turn on the camera and edit the show, but it would not happen without the input of scholars and historians who spend a lifetime understanding this and spoon-feeding me, this filmmaker who wants to try to tell a story. But my answer to her was, I wanted to know more about the roots of this nation. I have always felt that from a spiritual standpoint, if you will, that this country was founded by people who were directed by unseen forces. You can call that God, you can call it whatever you want to call it. But I feel like that this country was laid out by people who were in touch with the divine, if you will. Not in a spooky sort of way, but they were directed. And as we filmed, there were some things that took place that just led me to further understand that a little more clearly. I thought it was remarkable that this many bright, capable men could come together, and women, could come together to form a government for this country. And to me, that's more than coincidence. And so it was a real privilege to experience that. If I could share one behind the scenes, and that is, I tried to be site-specific wherever we filmed. So we're in Carpenter's Hall, we're in Independence Hall, at Constitution Hall, at Mount Vernon, Christ Church, Valley Forge, Plymouth Plantation, which is Massachusetts Bay Colony. But we tried to turn that clock back visually so that we could experience and touch and feel, if you will, a slice of history. And one particularly poignant time was for me at Constitution Hall. We came in on a Friday evening at 5:30 after they'd cleared their patrons out, and then we had the place until 9 o'clock the next morning, so we worked all night long. When you see these actors reenacting a significant piece of history, when the Constitution, after wrangling for 4 months, was signed, or at least approved and then ratified, you saw the genuine enthusiasm of these founding fathers. We told them what to do, and of course we set the camera and we shoot from different angles, but we had just extras who just wanted to be there, so we dressed them. You're Roger Sherman, you're whoever. And then we had some reenactors who've been doing this for 20 years. And it was fun to have that many people, George Washington, Patrick Henry, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison. They're in the same room, and they are working off each other's energy. And it was so believable. I just sat there almost dumbfounded at the amazing energy that was there. And so when you see them clapping and saying huzzah and hitting the floor with their canes, it was genuine excitement. It's as if they were there. We were all there. And so what we tried to do is to let the viewer be a fly on the wall of history. And I think we got there. So, my shameless plug, upstairs in the lobby is a companion book to this film and a sample of a DVD, which you can go to pbs.org if you like what you see here. I'm hoping that you'll want to have it for your own library. Randall Ballmer, professor at Dartmouth University, wrote the companion book, and it's stunning. It's a beautiful piece. And without any further, I would just like to introduce what you're going to see. There's 8 chapters to this show. You'll see 2 of them. You won't get too uncomfortable sitting that long, but it gives you a pretty good slice of the essence of this story. And so please enjoy, and again, thank you for this privilege and opportunity. And I didn't thank Charles Haynes, but thank you, Charles Haynes, for providing this facility and being part of this. Thank you.
In 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War. Against all odds, the Americans had won.
I was but the humble agent of favoring heaven, whose benign interference was so often manifested in our behalf, and to whom the praise of victory alone is due.
I think at the end of the war, Washington's view of divine intervention was heartfelt, and I think he was humbled by what had happened. Almost crushed in New York, Valley Forge, all the great images that we know. No rational person would have bet on this in 1776. And so it certainly seemed like a miracle. If anything, I think Washington believed that it was virtue rewarded and that a great sense of responsibility came with that this was a covenant. This wasn't victory without strings. The strings were you have to live up to what you've been given, fought for, but also given.
A conquering general had always taken up the reins of authority. Power was the usual reward for victory. But George Washington went home to Virginia. His home state was in the midst of a very different struggle. Several states had passed what was essentially a religious tax, government support for churches in the form of a general assessment. Thomas Jefferson was outraged.
To compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of religious opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. Thomas Jefferson.
The Baptist Church, too, opposed the general assessment, but the powerful Anglican Church strongly supported the tax, led by the eminent Patrick Henry. The Revolutionary orator, famed for "Give me liberty or give me death," had been raised as an Anglican, but as a lawyer he defended both Baptists and Quakers. He'd even been known to pay the fines of imprisoned Baptists out of his own pocket. His bill would eliminate the idea of a single state-supported church, but it would deliver tax money to ministers of various Christian denominations, linking government with church.
He thought that religious morality was absolutely critical to sustaining liberty, and therefore government had some role to play to shore that up.
Jefferson and Madison opposed any state support for religion, earning themselves a formidable political foe. The fiery Henry was universally revered in Virginia and had been elected governor 4 times. To a friend, Jefferson wrote,
"What we have to do, I think, is pray devoutly for his death." Thomas Jefferson.
Instead of praying, the scholarly Madison wrote a persuasive, if anonymous, argument against Henry's bill. The state had no authority to involve itself in religion, Madison said. True religious freedom did not mean that all churches would be linked to the government, but that none of them would. An effective argument. Some 11,000 Virginians signed a petition opposing the general assessment, and the measure soon died. Jefferson's Act for Religious Freedom, instead, became Virginia law in 1786.
The legacy of the Virginia Act is providing the intellectual foundation, underpinnings, and argument for a culture, a nation in which religion is a matter of choice and not coercion. And almost every other country, it had been an issue of coercion.
Jefferson's Act took a simple but revolutionary step. It entirely separated the institutions of government and religion. Jefferson and Madison had redefined the modern state.
We have in this country extinguished forever the ambitious hope of making laws for the human mind. James Madison.
Within a few years after it had begun, the United States was on the brink of failure. The former colonies were united only loosely under the Articles of Confederation. The federal government could neither pay its debts nor protect its people. Something had to be done. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states gathered in Philadelphia. James Madison came from Virginia 11 days before the meeting was supposed to begin. He needed to be prepared, for Madison wanted his delegation to present an ambitious plan to the convention. Instead of fixing the broken government, the Assembly would create an entirely new system, a constitution. The United States Constitution had a long, difficult nativity. 4 months of wrangling, compromise, and distrust. So much of Madison's original plan was discarded that he became bitterly disappointed. Before long, the Assembly was on the verge of breaking apart.
Sir, fairness demands that each state be represented equally and not according
The only one who could not be discouraged was 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin. Not known for his public speaking, Franklin delivered a perfectly timed and delicately articulate suggestion.
I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men.
Benjamin Franklin was virtually a second father of his country. George Washington had attained his high standing in the public mind through his generalship. Benjamin Franklin attained it through diplomacy. So though he said very little in the Constitutional Convention, whenever he spoke, everyone listened.
I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly each morning before we proceed to our business.
For the people's sake and for the country's sake, they needed to invoke God's blessing.
Your Excellency.
But what the founders did next was astounding. A kind of American Revolution all by itself. Most of them thought that a common religious belief was necessary for a moral society. Yet, the venerable Ben Franklin was quickly voted down. On the bottom of his speech, Franklin scrawled, "The convention, except 3 or 4 persons, thought prayers unnecessary." The impasse over the representation of states was eventually circumvented, and the Constitution was written during the course of 1787.
The Constitution is an amazing document. It's an amazing document in a structural fashion. It's an amazing document as a political fact because it was forged, in a sense, from nothing. It is amazing in its inventiveness, its creativeness. Nothing like this had existed before. And it's frankly amazing in its secularity. That is, its power isn't derived from claims about the divine.
The only mention of religion in the original Constitution was meant to enforce the idea of religious liberty. It came from Charles Pinckney, an unlikely source. Pinckney was an ambitious, unrestrained South Carolinian from a powerful family. He had no apparent interest in religious freedom. Against the inclinations of many delegates, Pinckney eventually pushed through a seminal line in Article 6.
And so I propose that no religious test should be required as a qualification to serve in public office or the other public trusts.
Pinckney's line distinguished the United States from the Old World and pointed the way toward a secular conception of the state. In the Finnish Constitution, God was not mentioned at all. Who was in charge? "This Constitution," the document says, "shall be the supreme law of the land."
The religion question wasn't seen as proper to a question about the structure of government. It was also seen as dangerous. In other words, if you put the religion question out in the structure of government, would that undermine the chances for the ratification of a new federal government?
To an extent, the Constitution displeased everyone. Benjamin Franklin lamented that it didn't abolish slavery. Several delegates lamented that the omission of a Bill of Rights, including religious freedom, was an appalling mistake. Near the end, Ben Franklin offered the convention his wisdom one more time, but decided it would be more effectively delivered by someone else. He asked his friend James Wilson to read it.
I doubt whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does.
Moments later, all but 3 of the delegates signed the Constitution. After its passage, even the disappointed James Madison began to look approvingly on the document. Many of the ideas in the Constitution had been his work, but he now pointed toward a different author.
It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in the Constitution a finger of that almighty hand which had been extended to our relief in the Revolution. James Madison.
The Constitution was finished and signed. The question was whether it would be accepted by the people. For it to become law, 9 states would need to ratify it in special state conventions. The debate was long and contentious. Finally, the supporters of the Constitution, called the Federalists, agreed to add a Bill of Rights. With that concession, the U.S. Constitution was ratified. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. His was a job and a role that was entirely undefined.
Newly independent Americans were acting on centuries of tradition in looking to their leader for guidance on religious matters, but George Washington was extremely careful in that regard.
He was deeply aware of his responsibility to bring people together. He did not want religion to be a divisive force in any way. To use language of Jesus and Jesus Christ often could be seen as divisive and unneeded.
If you appeared to speak in one form of religious language, you're going to alienate people who spoke another religious language. And Washington knew well that he had to rise above that fray.
We can credit him with laying the groundwork for religious freedom by leaving his own position neutral.
In 1790, when George Washington was in the second year of his presidency, he received a letter from the Jewish congregation Yeshuat Israel of Newport, Rhode Island. In reply, he wrote a memorable response about religion in America.
For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens.
People still come together at the synagogue in Newport every August, the anniversary of Washington's letter.
The reading of the letter is a very special occasion because the words are among the most important in terms of American history. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land
continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid.
There shall be none to make him afraid. The president's biblical reference was a poetic and powerful assurance. But Washington wasn't going to be president forever.
Everybody knew that religion would ultimately come to affect politics. And the question was, if the wrong group or groups got power with the federal government, wouldn't they try to establish their church as the national church? Couldn't some group just lop onto the federal government and say, okay, the Presbyterian church is going to be the national church, or the Congregational church is going to be the national church? And so there was a fear about the religion question if it wasn't handled.
What rights did small religious groups have in a new nation? And what about individuals? Perhaps a more power-hungry president than Washington would want to tell the people what they could say or where they could pray. Critics of the new Constitution clamored for changes, the changes that had been promised during the struggle for ratification 2 years earlier.
I beg to differ with you, Mr. Madison. The people of Virginia insist there be a list of assured individual liberties.
Patrick Henry, George Mason, these prominent anti-federalists are ones that really put the heat on James Madison and others to say, if you're going to have our support, if we're going to move forward, we really need to have a Bill of Rights as part of this. And one of the things that is preeminent there is a commitment to religious liberty.
Baptists, too, were strong supporters of religious freedom, for a very good reason.
The Baptist experience had been, unless it is made explicit, we are going to be burned.
government will turn against us. The established parties will persecute us, will tax us for the support of other religious institutions, namely their own.
Madison opposed a Bill of Rights on principle.
For James Madison, a list of certain individual rights implied that there couldn't be other rights. Whatever you didn't list could be denied. And changing the Constitution might be like opening up Pandora's box. All kinds of bad laws would follow.
Madison was forced by his Baptist constituents to deal with what he called this nauseating business of amendments.
If it had to be done, it would be better if Madison just did it himself. He took the lead in writing the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments that guaranteed what we now see as the basic rights of Americans. The very first amendment began,
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
That, I think, is rightly interpreted as meaning that the founders wanted to make sure that the institution of the church and the institution of the state were separate institutions.
The First Amendment has two parts. It bans the possibility of an established church, and it argues that everyone should have the free exercise of religion.
The First Amendment applied at the outset only to the federal government. So that we have to keep that in mind, that that First Amendment was saying the federal government cannot interfere with certain rights, but the states were still free to put limits on religious freedom and speech.
The First Amendment was a milestone in world history. For the first time, a national government promised to stay out of religion.
The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, our charters of freedom, they're our glue. They are what make us a country. And once we have that pulling us together, then we have the freedom and the ability to be diverse in all kinds of other ways.
It's not simply the freedom to choose whether to be a Mormon or an Episcopalian or a Catholic or a Muslim. It is the liberty of those not to believe. I am going to pursue my own destiny, my own code, my own vision, without being pressured by or buffeted by larger forces.
The first real-life test for religious freedom took place in the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
Adams was running for a second term against Jefferson, his longtime friend, and by now his political opposite. Together, they'd done much of the work to create the Declaration of Independence. But Adams had beaten Jefferson in the last election. Then, as president, he moved to suppress criticism of his government. He had made the government a force in religious matters, to great discontent.
Adams declared a fast day, a national day of fasting. It was written in very Christian language. Adams himself believed that the support of the church was necessary if government were going to stand. The fast eve, there were riots in the streets. That fast day led the sectarian Christians, the Baptists, the Methodists, and also Jews and others, to be very wary of Adams as a religious president who would impose his religious views upon them.
Jefferson, the vice president, was outraged. The election campaign of 1800 was bitter.
The election of 1800 was a crucial moment in our national history. People think our politics today is polarized, and it is, but boy, if you wanted to see polarization, you should look at the election of 1800. Bitterness, recriminations, nasty campaigning.
Jefferson hired James Callender, a writer who specialized in political slander.
Adams, the corrupt and despotic monarch, a hideous hermaphroditical character.
The Jefferson campaign called Adams a fool, a hypocrite, a criminal, a tyrant. But Adams' supporters retaliated. Jefferson was branded a weakling, a libertine, and a coward. Perhaps the worst accusation of all? This politician who said he was in a sect by myself. Did he believe in God at all?
The only question to be asked by every American, laying his hand on his heart, is, shall I continue in allegiance to God and a religious president, or impiously declare for Jefferson and no God?
Jefferson was accused of being an atheist, and he felt he was not an atheist. He never was. He learned his lesson, which Franklin had voiced several years earlier, 1784. He said, look, anybody who speaks out against religion is like spitting in the wind. You just don't do it in America.
The brutality of the campaign severed the old friendship. It was a tragedy of spirit that seemed to endanger everything that the two great men had worked so hard to create, the American system itself.
There was great fear that America was going to be destroyed because suddenly this two-party system had reared its head. And the Adams crowd, the Federalists, were saying that he was a pagan, Thomas Jefferson, a crazy deist, and that he was going to forever ban Christianity in the United States, and it got very heated.
The partisan maelstrom created genuine fear. Citizens actually believed that Jefferson would banish the Bible.
In 1800, one of the questions was, are we going to go the Jeffersonian Baptist route with no established religions of any kind and take the risk that religion will diminish in America and virtue go down with it?
It was a close and confused election. In the end, Jefferson won.
The election proved a point that reverberates to this day, that the implementation of religious freedom and separation of church and state were laws laid down by the founders, but the protection of those ideas was in the hands of the people.
If the freedom for religion, guaranteed to us by law in theory, can ever rise in practice under the overbearing inquisition of public opinion, truth will prevail over fanaticism. Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson and Madison both realized that freedom is a greater spur than force. The absence of federal government intervention actually helped religion to grow.
It was a tremendous upsurge. I was reading the diary of William Bentley, who kept talking about how the common people of the town were holding night religious meetings. And there would be sailors preaching, there would be women preaching, there would be African Americans preaching.
I shout hallelujah when I think of his life.
The First Amendment forbids an establishment and also protects the right of religious worship. And both of them working together have encouraged religious groups to go out and seek members. In the old days, in the days of an establishment, you didn't need to seek members because the state paid for religious services.
Look at the yellow pages of any town in America, and you can find forms of faith that founding fathers would have found unimaginable, but would have given free choice to any individual to belong to a wide variety of groups or to no group, and I think that would have pleased them.
The state of the United States at the beginning of the 21st century suggests that they were completely correct. They couldn't have been more correct. We now live in a society that has far more religions, far more religious participation, far more religion involved in the nature of society than happened to have been true at the time of the American Revolution and the creation of the First Amendment. And that, in part, is a testament to their conviction that religion would flourish on its own.
The great good news about the country is that religion has shaped us without strangling us.
The American Revolution we all know came with drums and guns, with battle and bloodshed. The quieter revolution was less spectacular and much slower, coming only step by step. But it was more unique in human history. This was the story of an idea, a government devoted to maintaining liberty, not uniformity.
The story of liberty is never a simple story, that it requires constant attention, constant thought. It requires argument and debate, and only out of that process can we achieve the goal that we want, which is religious freedom for all.
The Founding Fathers not only created the institutions by which we still govern ourselves, but they infused into the culture, our culture, all of our highest aspirations, our ideals, our greatest values, including religious liberty being one of the most important.
The struggle for religious liberty is a perennial struggle. There will always be the temptation to cut back on religious freedom. There will always be some end in view, some fear that people have that will tempt us as a people to dishonor the fundamental right to religious freedom and the right to bring faith into the public square.
It was a world historic contribution to say that yes, religion matters for the health of a society, but government must leave people free to pursue their beliefs as they see fit.
It is a system that we should change with great care, if at all.
I sit here? Hi, nice to see you, Doug.
Hey, Lee. Congratulations. It's good. Yeah, I made it. We'll have this figured out in a second.
Why don't you sit? Why don't you sit down there, Doug? Come. Yeah.
All right, there we go.
You're very bossy here. Good evening, everybody. I'm Nina Totenberg from National Public Radio, and welcome to this viewing of part of this wonderful film that Lee Grossberg has done, and we hope that you watch the whole thing and that Nielsen calls you up right away. So that it gets great ratings and he can make many more films. My thanks to WETA tonight, to Sharon Rockefeller, and all the other folks from WETA who have made this evening possible. So we just can identify some people here. We're very blessed tonight to have two great historians, and Douglas Brinkley, right there, from Rice University, and John Butler, Professor Emeritus from Yale, who is now an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota, right here, and Dr. Charles Haynes, Director of the Religious Freedom Education Project here at the museum. And I'm going to ask just a few questions, and then we have microphones there and there, I think, and any of you who have questions are invited, please, to come down and ask them. And I hope that all of you talk to each other, that it's not me asking you questions. It's a lot more interesting if you interrupt each other and disagree on occasion. So let me start with you, Professor Brinkley. So every school child learns early on in American history that this country was settled by oppressed religious minorities who came here to worship freely. But as we learn in this documentary, not the part you saw tonight, but if you see the whole thing, you'll see it. And some of us have read a good deal of these things that our founders wrote or said, and they were not particularly religious people as we think of religious people then or now, I think. Thomas Jefferson absolutely disdained formal religion. James Madison believed in a religion of conscience, that you sort of make your own religion. Benjamin Franklin certainly believed in God, but was not a church attender, and certainly didn't honor all of the Ten Commandments. So in enacting the religion clause of the First Amendment, were they merely reflecting their religious constituencies at home, or was their idea of religious freedom actually somewhat different than the people who settled the country decades and decades earlier? What exactly were they about?
Well, thank you for the question. And Lee, congratulations. I hope you all recognize how much work goes into that kind of recreation, and he does as good a job as that as anybody, so I'm honored to be part of this project. Look, the settling of America, as we all know, it's messy. I mean, Jamestown is a place of tobacco and the original sin of slavery, the Middle Passage. You go up to New England and people were being driven out of different colonies for different religious beliefs. I'm Catholic, so looking at how the Catholics were being treated in the New World, and Catholics were some of the first people here. The French Catholics in Florida for a short period of time, and obviously Spanish Catholics. What some people don't realize is even after the American Revolution, in Maryland, which was considered a great Catholic state, Jews had no rights. And in Massachusetts, the cradle of the American Revolution, if you were, in order to vote, if you were Catholic, you had to swear that you were not in any way working for the Pope. So it's, you know, these problems linger quite a bit. But let me just pick up on Thomas Jefferson for 1 second, because there was a lot of parts to your question. Jefferson's quite remarkable on religion. You know, when he was a student at William and Mary, he fell under the spell of the Enlightenment, studied all of the greatest philosophers, thought of himself really as a great intellectual. And in many ways, he, I think, is the main person whose energy pushed what he would call the wall of separation between church and state. We saw in the film here in 1800, I mean, Jefferson was called a howling atheist. Well, this was because he did a lot of unusual things in his career. I mean, you know, as he had once took the Bible and X'd out of it all, took Jesus's teachings, the New Testament, and anything that was dealing with the miracle, or showed Christ as somehow the Son of God in the religious realm, got X'd out, and it's called the Jefferson Bible. And so, you know, when you deal, and John Adams and Jefferson, as we saw in 1800, had a huge, political disdain for each other. But in the end, they both understood, Jefferson and Adams, coming at things differently, that you were going to have this separation that we celebrate so much today. I'll end my little opening spiel here by saying there's a man that few of you probably have ever heard of named Charles Thompson. But he was the secretary of the Continental Congress. And on the original Declaration of Independence, the one of July 4th, 1776, there are only two names on it, John Hancock and Charles Thompson. And in fact, Thompson's the one who read the press release, if you'd like, to the world that we're creating the United States. And in fact, Thompson had to organize all the politicians to come back and sign the great document that is here at the National Archives under glass, including a Catholic, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was one of the signers also. But Thompson, during the Revolutionary War, he kept all of the minutes for our founding of our country, all of these books of all of their arguments. He was the custodian of the signed Declaration of Independence. He kept it on him during the Revolutionary War. He's the one who came up with the idea for our Great Seal of the United States, the symbol with the eagle and all on it. He had been John Adams called him the Sam Adams of Philadelphia. He was a brewer, lawyer, but he was for women's equal rights, Native American equal rights. He wanted to abolish slavery. He actually rode with Washington from Mount Vernon to Wall Street, as we call it today, to get sworn in. But none of us have heard of Thompson. And in 1800, that election you just saw, he burned all of the minutes of the founding of our country, all the books that he kept, because he was so worried that these arguments over religion were going to rip our country apart, that he had documented some of their debates during the Revolutionary War about usages of of God and other things, and actually burned all of them. So the person who saved our signed declaration burned the minutes. That's why we don't have a multiple volume, minutes. In ending with that, one of the great things working with Lee is you learn so much on this topic, and it's such an intricate story, and I think he did just a really superb job.
Well, I'm gonna just make an observation here. I'm not a historian. I'm a reporter. You punted. I'm now going to ask the other two of you.
I think that it was great, but I would just, going back to the founders, if you had a longer list, you probably have a lot of very orthodox folks on the list, right? So we tend to pluck out those that, we sort of recognize maybe as reflecting kind of how we think about it, but there were plenty of very religious people on the list. But my point is that the First Amendment language, I would say, was a compromise. So if you came from a state where there was where a disestablished state like Virginia, or a place like Rhode Island that had no establishment, you could support that language because at least it got the federal government out of the religion business. However, if you came from Connecticut or Massachusetts, where establishments were continued, where state aid went to religions, you could support that language because it protected you in Massachusetts to keep your establishment. So when people ask me, well, were the founders for separation of church and state, were they against it and so forth? Actually, they were like us. They were divided. They had different views about it. They came up with a compromise arrangement. Many very religious people could support it for their own reasons. The interesting thing to me is that some of the people who supported, who are more traditionally religious, and Alexander Hamilton is more closely like that, they also supported disestablishment or separation because they really believed that it would be best for religion. But Hamilton worried that this arrangement might lead to the kind of country that wouldn't reflect Christian values, Christian culture. But instead of trying to legally enforce Christianity, he floated the suggestion to a friend at least that perhaps they should start a Christian constitutional society to encourage Christian religion in America, to encourage a kind of culture that would reflect Christian values. And I think the important message in that is that he looked to the marketplace of ideas to encourage Christianity in the society rather than looking to the government to coerce his faith.
Actually, I'm going to say that I somewhat disagree with Charles about the First Amendment being a compromise. Since I'm going to make the argument that the first part of the First Amendment, and it is rightly first part of the religion section of the First Amendment, that is, there are 16 words in the religion section, and I think the first 10, I have to count. If I do this on my fingers, I'm like my granddaughter. I'm going to have to start counting on my fingers. But in any case, let me point. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And what I think, I'm going to make the argument that it is very radical for a very simple reason, and that is that they used the phrase "an establishment of religion" without defining any of those four words. What did "an" mean? Does it mean any? What does "any" mean? What does establishment mean? It's a big, broad word. It was a big, broad word in the 18th century. And then "of." Okay, we don't have to count "of." And then religion. When the Congress debated, they decided not to use language about prohibiting national church or uphold the rights of conscience. They used the word religion. What does that mean? What did it mean in the 18th century? A woman in Massachusetts later named Hannah Adams, I have to think maybe before, now I've forgotten the copyright date, wrote a big book on world religions. And many people knew that religion meant many things, not just Christianity, not just Protestantism, not just Lutheranism. They were larger than Pastor Thwackum in Tom Jones, who said, when I think of religion, I think of Christianity. When I think of Christianity, I think of Protestantism. When I think of Protestantism, I think of the Church of England. That was his view. That was it. He doesn't need any more than that. In the 1780s, we do have numbers. We know about what people affiliated themselves. The largest church was the Congregational Church, and it accounted only for 20% of those Americans who even affiliated themselves with anything. So Americans knew that there were many religions. They knew even in the United States, the new United States, there were many. And so to use this word religion, I think, was a very radical thing. And I think it has, people who simply, Jefferson in his famous letter to the Danbury Baptists believed in the separation of church and state. Well, that narrowed the view of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is about much more than church and state. Church was one little thing. And state, in the 1780s, there wasn't much state. There is now, but there wasn't then. So I think it's actually a very radical thing. And then to say, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, ask the Supreme Court. Ask the Supreme Court in the 19th century, was polygamy a free exercise of religion? Well, they made a decision that it wasn't. We can all argue about that, but in any case, they made that decision. It's a very radical thing, even if, among other ways, it compromised the question of fights among various kinds of sects and groups.
Just add something to that. It was wonderful what he said. I agree with it completely. It's interesting to watch how George Washington grapples with this. He constantly uses the word providence as a kind of an inoculation for himself about having to grapple with it. And there's many letters of Washington where he'll say, "For God's sake," or and use God, but it has a feeling in a lot of his public utterances of almost some kind of secular God a little bit. Yet we know he was a deeply devout person. Even Jefferson, when he was president, would go to church every Sunday, dutifully. And so, there's a mythology around it on Washington and Jefferson as being, somehow not wanting to just be the wall for separation with church or state. In truth, they both just wanted to create a sustainable government. And there's a story about Abraham Lincoln when he ran for Congress of Illinois, and he was running against a Methodist evangelical gentleman and he had to sit Lincoln in the audience for the preacher, for his competitor for Congress's sermon. And at one point, the preacher, would-be politician said, "Anybody here who does not want to go to hell needs to stand." And everybody stood except Lincoln stayed seated. And he said, "Mr. Lincoln, where do you plan to go, sir? May I inquire?" And Lincoln said, "Congress." The point being, these are politicians, the founding fathers, and many of them are lawyers, and they're really looking for legal ways, careful ways, and ingenious ways to create our system that we have today.
Can you imagine a bunch of lawyers writing the religion clauses and using only 16 words? Must have been before billable hours.
A lot of editing.
Yeah, a lot of editing. Yeah.
Well, that gets me to my next question, which is, there's been a quite lively debate in the courts and on the Supreme Court over the meaning of the religion clause. For decades, the Supreme Court ruled that the ban on establishment of religion meant a very strict separation between church and state. No aid, even indirect aid, to parochial schools, no public religious displays, no prayer in school. Now there are a lot of conservatives who have a view that would allow far greater, what they call, accommodation between church and state. And one Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, has suggested that the ban on establishment of religion means only that the state cannot establish an official religion and nothing more. So I'll ask you, John, why don't you start? Which is it?
Well, in part, I've already answered the question, I think, because my view is that Justice Thomas is simply incorrect. He's historically incorrect. And I don't think that anyone in the 1790s would have understood that it only meant that we don't establish a national religion. Why? We take two things. One is Congress considered that language and didn't use it. Okay? And the second thing is there is the phrase, respecting an establishment of religion. It doesn't say church. So to make the argument to narrow the First Amendment somehow just as what would really be a rather piddling notion, frankly, about the establishment of a church, is, I think, to demean the amendment. It really takes away the revolutionary meaning of the amendment. This is the first time a Western government, any government, had ever said the state and religion, not just a church, should be separated. And I think that that is meaningful. I think it's meaningful, was meaningful then, and I think it is the proper way, the meaningful way to interpret it now.
Moreover, the word establishment was commonly used at the time of the writing of the First Amendment to refer to arrangements like Connecticut and Massachusetts, which we might call multiple establishments, where funding went to more than one church. So that if the First Amendment was only intended to prevent a national church, that word establishment really wasn't used in that way. It was used in a different way to suggest prohibiting an arrangement that would, like some have argued, Chief Justice Rehnquist used to argue, that really the First Amendment would allow the state to aid religions as long as it didn't prefer one over the other. But I do think that John's right. I think that the language of the First Amendment, going back to how those words were used when the First Amendment was written, really forbids that, at least on the federal level. Now, what Justice Thomas, of course, is suggesting is that the doctrine of incorporation, that the First Amendment applies to the states through the 14th Amendment, doesn't apply to the Establishment Clause. And he argues that that's because it isn't an individual liberty and it's a limitation on the state. My view is, I guess because I think Thomas Jefferson was right, James Madison was right, and before them Roger Williams was right, that no establishment is not just a limitation on the state. It's an actual core principle of religious liberty necessary for full religious liberty, so that free exercise and no establishment together give us what we call freedom of conscience in the United States.
Of course, Doug, the First Amendment today is not the same First Amendment that the founders enacted, because there was the Civil War and there was the 14th Amendment. And then in the 20th century, the Supreme Court applied the Bill of Rights to the states, which that wasn't the law as originally contemplated. So it is a different amendment today.
It is, but I think where it's all, the continuity is it's all politics. And, today where people are constantly worried that we've taken the Pledge of Allegiance out of school, and that even though we have our founders have "in God we trust," but now we want some secularists want to do away with that. They'll go back on the right and say presidents like Franklin Roosevelt put God in his D-Day prayer, and that somehow religion is a national religion, is part of our country, that we actually almost have a national belief in God. Atheists, of course, challenge this constantly, but you can't help but admiring the language of the Founding Fathers, and how I think when you're dealing with Clarence Thomas today, they're just making political hay out of it because of the Reagan Revolution. You started getting evangelicals going, and people have a backlash to the 60s in many ways, and they're starting the feeling that you can't have a cross in a national park, or because it's or you can't, the government has to be so hyper cautious of kind of denuding religion out of our public policy discourse is just inflamed things. And I think the argument you're talking about with Clarence Thomas is just a further extension really of our right-left divide. In a fear of the newness. We saw how many different religious groups now are coming to America. This was anticipated by some of the founders, but it's very real. We have a country with Muslims and people Buddhist, and these are boom religions going on right now, and people are, I think, are luckily able to continue to have freedom of religion in the United States, and the Clarence Thomas seems to me to be just a rearguard action or reaction that's just not really going anywhere. It's a product of the politics of the right from the 80s to today.
I guess I should observe here a rather interesting thing, which is that Protestants were the majority of this country for a very long time, and they controlled most of the levers of power for a very long time. And it wasn't until the 20th century that there was a Jew on the Supreme Court. I think maybe there was a Catholic some point in the 1800s, a single one. Today, there are no Protestants on the Supreme Court. There are 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. And that is, even for somebody as youthful as I am, it is just an astonishing fact, because when I started covering the Supreme Court, there was 1 Catholic and 1 Jew.
And there's a Mormon for the Republican nomination, Mitt Romney, and 2 Catholics for the VP, Joe Biden. And
yes, for the first time we have no white Protestant running on either ticket. Moreover, the demographics out now tell us that we're no longer a Protestant majority nation for the first time in our history. It's fallen below 50%. And that's a very important shift in many ways, not just symbolically, but it really does call us to rethink how we're going to work this arrangement out, because I think many in the majority faith for a very, very long time just assumed that the culture would reflect their values and who they are. And that's why we've had so many school fights over these symbolic things, the creche and the lobby and the prayer and so forth. It's because people feel deeply that they want to hold on to the kind of country, the kinds of schools that reflect who they are. Well, now as things shift and as the diversity becomes more, expands, we have to rethink this arrangement and perhaps for the first time begin to really live up to the promise of religious liberty. It's one thing to believe in it and to, but it's quite another thing to actually live up to it with this much diversity.
And if I just make one little point, and that is that the concept of Protestants as a group is dubious because there are so many different kinds. And my point is, even as a historian, I would say that was true in the 18th century. The 18th century, we had an exceedingly religiously diverse country in which most people don't know this, most people actually didn't belong to anything. Actually, our rise in church membership goes like this up to the 1960s and 70s. It doesn't go, as our rhetoric suggests, like this, down. It goes up. And then Protestants don't agree. So we've always been religiously diverse. And there's a kind of myth that at some point everybody thought the same. But that's the way, we have a myth about our grandparents were always more religious than we were. Guess again.
There's a recent Pew poll that shows that the number of people who are unaffiliated with any particular religion has gone up rather dramatically. It's now 1/5 of the country, 30%, I think, or more, 32%, a third almost, of adults under the age of 30. Now, we go through these waves in the country. I don't know that it means anything. Yes or no? What?
Well, I think that we have become a more secular society, and where yet religion still matters. I mean, Mitt Romney has had to answer questions about his Mormonism. John F. Kennedy, famously leading the way for Catholics, had to go to Houston and give that famous talk, basically saying, "I'm not that good of Catholic." These things happen, but you can look forward to the fact that we constantly, I think, are opening up to just a kind of open-mindedness, most Americans. If you look at the 19th century, I mean, what happened to Mormons being pounded out of Illinois and, tarred and feather, and Joseph Smith killed, and having to be driven to Utah. Now you have a person of Mormon faith. I mean, the Know Nothing Party in the 19th century was anti-Catholic and anti-Mormon, and it wasn't just that fringe, because Millard Fillmore, a former president of the United States, was championing the Know Nothing Party. So the anti-reaction to certain religions and people of race or ethnicity is there. Hate is very real in America, but most people now believe, at the core thinking of the founders, that I think there's a quote, I wish I could remember it, that Jefferson said. He used to be the most pithy, and particularly in his letters, but he said, look, as long as you're not ruining my day or breaking my leg, believe in what you want to believe in. And I think that sense of individualism is still very prevalent in the United States. But yet, we don't define ourselves. I'm a professor at Rice. Students don't come in. I'm a Presbyterian or Episcopalian quite as much as maybe there was in a different generation.
And we have to also remember that unaffiliated or no religious preference doesn't mean, of course, that people aren't religious in that group. There's actually quite a small number of people who identify as freethinkers, atheists, humanists. So it's complex, but I think that one of the things that is striking is that it's very difficult to run for office, and we can see that in the current campaign. It's very difficult to get elected unless you at least profess belief in God, and so I think we still have in our political arena certain expectations of politicians, and I think we're still quite a distance away from, for example, someone openly being atheist being accepted as a candidate for President of the United States. I think maybe Muslims would have an easier time, a Muslim candidate would probably, than atheists. According to the polls, the atheists are even more despised, so I think that we still have a lot of barriers in our political life. Even if people aren't deeply religious in that group, or if they're unaffiliated, they still think religion is important, and they still expect a certain level of religiosity in their political leaders.
Well, and just to add to that, I'm not sure we can have a president that's not a Christian at this moment in time. Mm-hmm. And really, when you look at a lot of these debates over religion and the founding of our country, was Jesus Christ the Son of God or not? And some of the Enlightened principles question that. And yet you always had to be careful. It was bad enough being called a deist, but if you're called an atheist, you were really going to be marginalized. And in some ways, it's still that way. I can't imagine a major candidate running for president saying they're not Christian at this moment in time.
No, I can't either. Could I ask anybody in the audience, if you have a question, come to the microphone? I see a gentleman over here.
In the last month, in my church adult Sunday school class, one of the members brought her grandson in and told our class that in his government grade school, in doing a report or in the classroom, he wasn't allowed to say AD when talking about a date, a year in history. And I know in the Constitution, I've heard very accomplished scholars claim God is not mentioned in the Constitution, yet it's signed in the year of our Lord, which to me seems very clear and plain, without argument. But I'm just wondering, at that time, was there any disagreement or dissension about signing a government document like that in the year of our Lord? And I'm assuming that in the French Revolution, there weren't similar documents signed that way. Were there? I don't know.
Well, I'm not aware of any, but let me just suggest that even in the 18th century, people were quite free with language, and so simply signing a document AD doesn't necessarily signify anything in particular. And let me give you another example. Quakers could testify in court without having to swear on a Bible. No one disputed their testimony once you got past the Puritans hanging them, all right? So, but once you got past the Puritans hanging them, Puritans come for religious freedom and then they hang Quakers, so okay, so there are shifts here. But, it's just, I don't think it's a particularly significant point, and one way or the other. It was just a commonality, a commonality of phraseology. That's all that I would say about it.
But let me just add that I think that's poor pedagogy for a public school teacher to do that. Even if schools and textbooks, public schools are going towards the use of the Common Era rather than AD and so forth and so on. Even if that's where they're moving, because many historians are using that now, all right. I mean, that I can see that. But for a teacher to tell a student, you can't say AD.
But there are also, you can't deny, there are stupid people. There are stupid people everywhere.
But it does, Nina, I think the important point behind the question to me, you know, when we talk about separation of church and state, we talked about it earlier, it gives it a bad name. When people go so far, and really well-meaning, they think, oh, you can't say that here. And I'm not sure of the motivation of that particular teacher, but I mean, in general, I work in public schools a lot. When public school teachers tell students they can't mention God, they can't do this, they can't do that, what it does, it rebounds on the First Amendment. It undermines religious freedom, because the First Amendment separates church from state, but not religion from public life or politics. And students are allowed to express their views, and if they happen to want to use AD, they should be allowed to do so. So I think it goes to, it's a small example, but of a deeper problem with how people misuse separation and hurt separation as a result.
Yes.
Hi, I just want to thank you so much for this thoughtful discussion. I wanted to mention there was a recent report by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life mentioning the rising restrictions on religion in the United States. They mentioned that they found that between 2007 and 2010, restrictions on religion in the United States had increased from a low category to a moderate category. I just wanted to get any comment from you as to whether or not you think, if any, there are any threats to religious freedom today. And if you do, what are those threats in America?
Well, we saw the problem in New York City over at the Ground Zero when people wanted to, Muslim, wanted to worship near that site. It seems like ancient history now, but it was a couple years ago, and it was a huge brouhaha over that, and it brought to the surface some of this simmering, animosity that people are having, particularly to the Muslim world right now. The whole go to an airport and there's a feeling that people's rights are being infringed. If you're a Muslim or you look different, you're going to be searched more. The Arizona law that you heard President Obama mention last debate, where if you look, different, that you can just be pulled over by police if you're, in other words, Mexican. So there's still all this sort of layer, I think, of intolerance that's going on, and it does have a religious kind of connotation to it in some cases. I mean, it's not, the Catholic Church in Arizona is much more welcoming to fellow Catholic Mexicans than some of the evangelical people in the state of Arizona are, and, same thing you could say in New York.
And I just add that one person's restriction is another person's rights. And so it depends on what they mean by restrictions. And many people may say religious freedom is restricted, but may mean something quite different by that. So, of course, right now, the Roman Catholic Church, the bishops, believe that their religious freedom is being restricted because of the health care mandate. Other people say, no, that's not a restriction on religious freedom. Therein lies a very important debate. What is religious freedom? Should Catholic affiliated or religiously affiliated institutions be exempt from that mandate? Not just churches, but Catholic charities and so forth. So that argument is really, defines what restriction is. I think the argument between, or the tension between gay rights and same-sex marriage and religious liberty, one side says this is the great threat to religious freedom. The more we have gay rights, the more we have same-sex marriage, the more our religious freedom is going to be restricted. The other side says, no, that's not true. You can have religious freedom, you just can't impose on our civil rights and so forth. Again, what is restriction? I do think, going back to the Ground Zero thing, that the Islamophobia in the United States is the greatest threat to religious freedom today in America. Not because of what governments are doing so much. In most cases, governments are doing pretty well. Government in New York did pretty well on the Ground Zero thing. But when you have some 50 communities, according to Pew's map, where mosque protests have taken anti-mosque protests have taken place, when you have some 30 states considering or having already passed anti-Sharia laws, when you have people intimidated, when you have people being killed at the Sikh temple, apparently because this fellow thought he was killing Muslims, when you have this, and there's more and more and more, when you have this growing intimidation and violence and targeting of people because they happen to be of a certain faith, even if the government's doing okay on protecting religious freedom and trying, it's the hearts and minds of people. So American Muslims are not doing okay if this is where we're going in this country. And I do think that's the greatest threat to religious freedom in America today.
Yes, sir.
Well, I had two issues. One is I think
Pick one.
Jefferson thought that religion was pernicious, I think, in terms of the state. And there's a part of his writing where he says that the religious leaders will always side with the political leaders to have control in the state. And he says that no priest-ridden society can ever be a democracy. And he ends that paragraph saying, "I've therefore sworn on the altar of God eternal vigilance against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." I think you can infer that he meant religion. But the other threat that I think exists is a still unfinished right of conscience and expansion of rights of conscience. And to give one example, there's a struggle been going on for quite some time within the military ranks about whether people should have to object to all war in order to be conscientious objectors, or whether they can be what the system calls selective objectors, which is the more common position to oppose a particular war. And in many other countries like England, if a soldier says he doesn't want to go to the service in Afghanistan, he's just reassigned. He's not punished like they are here.
I made a note here because I was been reading on and working on this on Jefferson. At one point, Jefferson called chapters of the Bible so much untruth and charlatanism. So you can go through a lot of Jefferson's letters to people and pull out a quote, and he was such an eloquent writer. The late Washington journalist Christopher Hitchens, who just died, wrote the famous kind of atheist book of our time, God, popular atheist book, God Is Not Great. Also, it did a book on Jefferson. That was his hero, Jefferson's view on religion. Atheists tend to like Jefferson, even though he wasn't truly an atheist, but he just had great suspicion, I think, in the end, that the seeds of destruction of the United States were going to come in, and if we did not make our religious freedom something golden and real and enduring. And that way, it's really stunning how prescient Jefferson was as a leader. I mean, he at one point called himself, Jefferson, a sect unto myself. And I think many people feel that right now. Well, people that say are Catholic, it's like Joe Biden. Well, I take this part of the Catholic doctrine, I take this part. And we all kind of pick and choose to make our religious self. And that's very Jefferson and very American.
Yeah, but isn't it great that whatever his views on religion, he gave us a framework for defending the religious liberty rights of conscience of everyone. People of all religions or no religion. So, whatever his private views, or whatever his religious views, he gave us religious freedom, or helped to give us religious freedom. And that's the extraordinary thing. That's why the Baptists liked Jefferson so much. And they knew his views, and they knew he wasn't one of them religiously, but they also understood that here was someone who was advocating for an arrangement in the country that would protect their right to be Baptist. And Jefferson trusted the marketplace. And he felt that his view, his rational view, his Enlightenment view, would prevail if the marketplace were allowed. He actually believed that if schools, would just teach what is reasonable, there would be no Trinitarians left in a generation. He said this. They would go away because people would see it so irrational. Now, he was wrong about that, but he trusted that if we set this arrangement up, the truth eventually will win out.
And when Jefferson was president, big accomplishment, the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of America. But anybody who lived in the Louisiana Territory, including, New Orleans, was filled with Catholics. So overnight, all these Catholics were becoming American citizens. And I read once a letter that an Ursuline nun wrote from New Orleans to Jefferson saying, the French flag is gone, and now we have an American flag up, and it's America's a Protestant country. What does it mean to our group of nuns here, Ursuline nuns? So Jefferson wrote this beautiful letter to her on, you are exactly the type of citizens. You're taking care of the poor, you're working with orphanages, and you will always be protected. It's so beautiful, I can't summarize it, but to read it, it's quite chilling. And if you go to that academy in New Orleans today, it's prominently placed there, reassuring all those new Catholic Americans in 1803 that they were going to have equal rights here in America.
We have one other question, and then we're out of time.
Hi, I'm Chelsea with the Catholic News Service, and I was wondering if you could each comment on, you kind of did, but the HHS mandate and how that issue that so many are suing over is being affected by religious liberty.
The HHS mandate, you want to comment on that? Well, this is dangerous stuff, okay? So my view is that the bishops are not right. I think that the mandate does not require, it's a technical thing, but it involves how it is that things like birth control are paid for. And I would like to point out something else, and that is I think that any number of Catholics, including some bishops who aren't particularly vocal about this, would really go back to other issues, and they would go back to an older tradition of Catholic social teaching that involves a care for other people, a care for hospitals, a care for individuals, a broad sense of what our public and religious responsibilities are. And I would just point out to you, there's a story in the Minneapolis Star and Tribune this morning that the Roman Catholic Church is the largest single funder of the anti-gay marriage amendment that will be voted on in Minnesota as a constitutional amendment this fall. And there are many Catholics. I drive through neighborhoods in Minneapolis with signs that says another Catholic voter voting no, meaning that they are voting against the amendment to ban gay marriage in the Minnesota Constitution. And there are letters in the Minneapolis paper that criticize the Archbishop of St. Paul for the more than $1.5 million that the Archdiocese is providing to support this amendment, that this could go for child care, that this could go for nursing, that this could go for a wide variety of social services that the Church has, in fact, supported for so long. So there's a question of where is politics here? Where is the line? And I think it is a difficult point, and I think that actually Catholics themselves have very conflicted views about this kind of question that don't accord with the teachings, with the pronounced views of the collective view of the bishops. I want to take a little different approach, just to mix it up a bit, and say that I think this was handled very badly by the administration. I think that in the first place, the folks working on this should have sat down with the bishops and other religious leaders and looked at how to do this in a way that could protect conscience and at the same time carry out healthcare reform in the way that they think it had. Maybe they wouldn't have come up with something that the bishops, for example, would have agreed with. We don't know, because that did not happen. It was only after it came out and there was all this backlash that then they retreated, the administration retreated, said, oh, now let's try to figure something out. And now they have, they've changed it. I think from my point of view in terms of protecting conscience, whatever you think of the views, that isn't the point. The point here is how to, I think we should always be asking the question in this country, how do you best protect liberty of conscience? How do you best do it? You can't always do it in a way that will satisfy everyone, and you certainly can't always do it in a way if it harms other people. I want people to have access to health care. I want women to have full access to health coverage personally. But I do think we have to think of ways. And carving out for religious institutions was one important step, good. But religiously affiliated institutions also have claims of conscience, whether you agree with them or not. And I just think there should have been more hard work done to try to find a way. Now, right now, I won't get in the weeds, but we're in a period of a year of looking at it, thinking about it, and depending on the election, A lot can change, but the point is, in that year, we really should try, the administration should try, whoever's president, the best to try to do whatever can be done to keep these charities involved in what they're doing, but at the same time, separate them from doing something that will violate their conscience to the extent we can without denying coverage. And I know that's a tall order, but I do think we can do better than we have.
It may be an insurmountably tall order.
Yeah, it's tough.
Very briefly, on the political front with American Catholics, it's interesting that the Catholics in America were Democratic for so long. And Roe versus Wade really started changing things up, and it's the group like the Knights of Columbus, Father Michael McGivney created in the late 19th century. You know, the Knights are kind of the white male swing voters in the Midwest, and there's this battle. Reagan started winning the Knights over, and it seems to be the gay marriage and Roe versus Wade are really are hot issues in Catholicism, and it's because polling shows a lot of Catholics in the Midwest moving toward the Republican side, gaining mileage on that. President Obama's, I recently did an interview of him, which will be coming out next week, and he's very much on this Roe versus Wade right now, that taking the women's point of view, while the Republicans are looking for those Knights of Columbus voters in Milwaukee and Toledo and places like that.
I think that Governor Romney is pretty interested in getting women's votes right now. Now, you can argue that abortion is not part of that, but this is really the most fought over territory. I don't really understand some of the statistics myself, but if Governor Romney can't cut into the lead that Obama has with women, and he has cut into it in the last couple of weeks since the first debate, or alleged debate, that he can't win.
I think there's that central fear that that the Obama administration is bringing to women, that about the Supreme Court, that if you get another Republican in the next, if he loses, Romney comes in, then Roe versus Wade's going to get overturned. And you see that coming into the president these last weeks, something that if you're sitting on the fence and you're a woman, but you believe in women's health issues and women's right to choose, you'll get organized and go out there for President
So
Obama.
come back October 30th for a discussion of the Supreme Court and religion, because I do think that a lot is at stake, depending on all sides, because many of the religious liberty votes, and also social issue votes, are very, very close. We've had a good many 5-4 decisions on Establishment Clause questions, and we're going to get some very important questions come to the court soon on the Establishment Clause. So, 5-4, and, who gets elected president is going to determine a lot.
Gentlemen, I'm going to end this because we're past our time, but I'm going to end it on my territory, which is the Supreme Court. I have spent a career covering elections and the Supreme Court and telling people every 4 years, this year it might really matter. The Supreme Court might really matter as an election issue. It never matters. That has nothing to do with whether it should matter. It never matters. And you cannot find a constitutional scholar left in this country who thinks in this election it's going to make even an iota's worth of difference, because people for whom it matters have long ago taken sides on issues that are that fall into the categories of Democratic issues or Republican issues. So you should come back October 30th to find out why it should matter. And with that, I'm going to thank the author of this film, the contributors to the film.
Didn't he hog the mic the whole time?
He was here to answer any question that came up.
I just want to say one thing. I think the mark of a good filmmaker is listening. There's nothing I could have added to what these right gentlemen have said.
So with that, I think we'll close it up. We're about 10 minutes over as we are. Thank you all for coming and for listening.